My guest again today is Wally Manheimer.
Well, I have written a paper in a scientific journal whose name is Original Sin, Prophets, False Prophets, Witches, Communists, Preschool Sex Abuse, and Climate Change. And the 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 paper is written on this first slide, and also greatly shortened versions of it have been put out by both the CO2 Coalition and the Clintel Foundation, and those are there. Those just have a shorter name: False Prophets and Climate Change. Well, the CO2 Coalition and organizations have top-of-the-line scientists, environmentalists, economists, you know what. They've examined the claims of a rapidly onrushing climate disaster and have basically found them to be false. And it's gotten to the point, at least in my mind, in many of our minds, where this isn't even controversial anymore, although a lot of people would disagree. But these claims also emphasize that windmills and solar panels with battery backups can just not possibly power modern civilization. So it's not really the point of this talk to reiterate what the Will Happers and Dick Linsons and Mark Mills have said to that. These are the real experts. Instead, it takes a look at how did we get into this mass delusion, as I call it. And does the Bible or American history or recent motion picture provide any insights? And this talk concludes that they do. It sort of tries to give a story of the climate disaster and things it's related to, and where the Bible and American history provide some insight. Well, there are two conflicting religious principles. One is original sin, which you probably heard the name of, and the AI summary is right here. It's in Christian theology, and it makes the case that humans are inherently sinful, and God gave us pretty much a perfect environment in the Garden of Eden, but because of our sinful nature, we could not keep it. And in the Bible, the story is one of the two first humans, Eve, eating the forbidden fruit, and there's a picture of it right here. And because of she disobeyed God's will, they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and the serpent who tempted to do it has been ordered to only crawl on its belly from then on. And another, and I would call them a conflicting religious principle, is called Tikkun Olam. And the AI summary is here. It's a Hebrew phrase meaning repairing the world, and it's a concept that Judaism refers to actions taken to make the world a better place. It encompasses various forms of social action, justice, and efforts to improve the human condition by turning scarcity into abundance. So those are basically the two AI summaries of each. You just do a Google search on each. And here we have a picture of what I think of as at least Tikkun Olam in the biblical world. You have a picture of Jesus feeding the masses with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And perhaps this is an example that even Jesus thought he was doing Tikkun Olam. I think very likely the word Tikkun Olam was used by Hebrew scholars in Jesus's time. Well, let me have the next, Tom. Well, regarding the use of fossil fuels, some people think that God gave us a perfect world, which we should not pollute by digging up fossil fuels, like eating the forbidden fruit. And hence, it's not a big jump, at least in my mind, to think that doing this is like original sin, according to the people that do this. Others say that God did not give us a perfect world, and it's up to us to repair it. That is to go back to Tikkun Olam. So we should dig up fossil fuels, burn them as cleanly as possible to improve the human condition and turn scarcity into abundance. And people in the Coalition, certainly, and many others are in this camp, that fossil fuel is a blessing to humans, not a curse that we should avoid. Let me go back to the next time. Well, not too many generations after the generation, God threw something else into the mix, according to the Bible. He decided to actually talk to a few humans and tell them what to do, and he would warn them about damage he was about to do, and give them some or all of a means to avoid it. And this podcast defines such people, such humans who talk to God in the biblical world, as prophets. And I'm certainly not a biblical scholar, but let me just give you some examples with some of the biblical quotations of some of them. Probably the earliest prophet is Noah. God told to him, and some of it is occluded, well, I'll just say the water covered more and more of the earth until the high mountains everywhere were covered, from Genesis 7:19. And this was God warning Noah of the flood to come and telling him how he could avoid it, which Noah succeeded in doing, which is, at least according to the biblical story, why we're all here now. Another prophet, of course, is Abraham. He is the first patriarch, and God saw that Sodom and Gomorrah were evil and vowed to destroy them. Well, Abraham had a fair number of conversations with God, and he tried to bargain with God to save Sodom and Gomorrah. And finally, God agreed that he would not destroy it if Abraham could find 10 righteous individuals. And I recall it, Abraham started with 1 and God refuses. Then he said 5 and God still refused. Finally, when he got to 10, God would agree to not destroy the city. But unfortunately for Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham couldn't find them. So then, as it says in the Bible, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Genesis 19:21. So here are 2 examples of prophets, and I'll give you 2 more on the next slide. Well, the main prophet probably in both the Old and New Testament is Moses, who just had many conversations with God. I mean, God was virtually his best friend. And God called him up to Mount Sinai and gave him the 10 Commandments, actually etched in stone, which he carried down from the mountain and showed to the Hebrews. And thousands of years later, these still remain the basis of our morality. And up on the upper left is a picture of Moses coming down, presenting these stone tablets to the Hebrews in the desert. But the desert wasn't so rosy for them. After years in the desert, the Hebrews were thirsty. They had very little food, very little water, and they were about to start a revolution. And Moses and God had a couple of conversations about this, and finally God took mercy and said, and here's the biblical quote, "Pass before the people, take your staff, strike the water, and strike the rock, and water will come gushing out, and the people will be able to drink." So Moses struck the rock as he was told, and the water came gushing out as the elders looked on. That's Exodus 17:5 and 6. And on the lower left is a picture of the water rushing out and coming out of the rock, just as God said it would. So these are the prophets. These are people who actually spoke to God. But there's a wrinkle in it, and how do you know someone is going to come claiming that he spoke to God, but he really didn't speak to God? And this was actually brought up by several places in the Old Testament, but probably one of the best is in the New Testament. Do you have the next one, Tom? The place Jesus actually warned his flock on it is in the Sermon on the Mount. Beware of false prophets when they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are raging wolves. And this is from Matthew 7:15. And this brings up a question. If someone claims to be a prophet, how do you know he's a real prophet and not a false prophet. So let me have the next slide, Tom. Well, there are really two tests to tell false from true prophets. First, we'll look at how you do it in the biblical world, and then we'll look at how you do it in the modern world. In the biblical world, the person claims that he spoke to God. And the question is, did he? And it's really impossible to check. There's no way to check whether he spoke to God or not. But fortunately, there's another thing, and that is, did his prophecies occur? And you know that Noah was a real prophet because there really was a flood. And we know that Abraham was a real prophet because Sodom and Gomorrah were really destroyed. And we know that Moses was a prophet because water really came out of the rock. So in the biblical world, you really can't check whether he spoke to God or not, but you can check to whether these prophecies occurred. Well, in the modern world, it's a little simpler because nobody in the modern world is going to claim he spoke to God. They're going to claim that they have scientific knowledge or secret government knowledge or knowledge of psychology or witchcraft or whatever. But then, did he have the claimed knowledge? Well, it's really pretty easy to check. You just look at the same sources he got. I mean, if he claimed secret government knowledge, you just talk to a couple of other people who have the same levels of classification, and they may say he did or he didn't. And the other, of course, is, did any of these prophecies occur? And you can check that just as easily in the modern world and in the biblical world. So these are the tests I'm going to give. So this is about as far as I can go as a biblical scholar, and I'm certainly not a biblical scholar, but I have a little bit of knowledge on it. But let's take a look at American history and see. These false prophets can really do an extraordinary amount of harm. And I'm going to give 3 examples of them from American history, which things you really can't deny. But how does the harm by these false prophets persist? I mean, usually people can see right in front of their nose that they're wrong, but they persist. And I would say no one has an answer to this, but I think the best explanation is given by Dick Lindzen. And let me read the quote that he made. What historians will definitely wonder about in future centuries is how deeply flawed logic, obscured by shrewd and unrelenting propaganda, actually enabled a coalition of powerful special interests to convince nearly everyone in the world that CO2 from human industry was a dangerous, planet-destroying toxin. It will be remembered as the greatest mass delusion in the history of the world, that CO2, the life of plants, was considered for a time to be a deadly poison. I think there's no other explanation for why the harm these false prophets do persist so long is that somehow we could fall into a mass delusion. And for some reason, mass delusions initiated by these false prophets can persist for a very long time. And there are many examples of this in American history. And sometimes they're only ended by the action of what I'll call a good wish. And that's because the first of these is the Salem Witch Trials, which was a case of mass delusion encompassing an entire community. And I've been fascinated by the idea of mass delusions. I've written a short book on the climate change and the role of fusion, which is something I really know about in it. And here's just a copy in case anybody, here's just the cover of it in case anybody's interested. But the idea of false prophets and good witches, I think, is sort of an interesting one, which probably you ought to pursue, and I will pursue it certainly with 3 cases of real harm false prophets have done in American history. And I certainly would claim, I'm not a historian, but I certainly know more American history than I do about the Bible. So let me have the next slide, Tom. There's the Salem Witchcraft Trials is the earliest one I know, and they began in the home of Reverend Parris, who lived with his wife and his daughter and a niece, and also a slave named Tituba, who was acquired from Barbados. And she regaled the girls with stories of magic and witchcraft, and ultimately the girls seemed to have many fits and just screaming and yelling. And Reverend Paris interpreted this as witchcraft, and it spread to many of the girls living in Salem. And ultimately, the girls accused many people of witchcraft, and many were arrested and hung. And the amazing thing is that these girls never claimed to see a witch or see the physical reality of witchcraft, but what they saw was what they called the specter of witchcraft. That is, these things are things occurring only in their imagination. In fact, it was called spectral evidence at the time, and it was allowed to be used in the trials. So someone says he's not a witch, and the girls get up and say, "Oh, yes, you are. I see the specter of you doing this or that," which is consistent with witchcraft. And many were both convicted and executed on the basis of spectral evidence alone, which I'd say in the modern world, it's amazing. Well, let me say the 20th and 20th century world, it's amazing. The witchcraft is the modern world, according to the Bible. But I think we'll see that there are analogs to spectral evidence in today's modern world. But anyway, back in Salem, if you're accused of a witch, one way to escape the hangman was to confess and to say you're a witch, but you're going to recant your evil ways. And then you're just put in jail. And the jail held many, many people. Well, I have a couple of illustrations on this in the next slide. False prophets. The false prophet was Reverend Paris in Salem. And on the left is the picture of Tituba scaring the girls. And the girls saw the specter of the witchcraft, and this led to the actual specular evidence which was used in trials. And there are a few brave people who actually challenged the girls. And this was very dangerous. One who did was John Proctor, and he was actually executed for challenging the girls' spectral evidence on witchcraft. And on the upper right is an image from the time of John Proctor at his execution. Well, things really got very bad in Salem. The jail had like 150 people. There were like 20 that were executed. And not only that, they were so preoccupied with witchcraft that they were neglecting their fields. Starvation was a real problem. And fortunately for them, they had a new governor who I'll call the Good Witch. Have the next slide. And these Good Witches are real heroes of mine. The Good Witch was Governor William Phipps, who saw that something had to be done to stop this. And he spoke to a lot of people in New York, which had less of the Puritan, less involved with the, Puritan view of things. And he decided that spectral evidence had to be outlawed. And not only did it have to be outlawed, but convicted witches in the jail were allowed to recant their confessions. And this ended the Salem witchcraft mass delusion. And the panic lasted less than a year. And really, they have to thank Governor. Here's an image of Governor Phipps, who actually ended it. Well, let me go to the next false prophet a couple of 100 years later. And this was Senator McCarthy. And his false prophecies and the harm he did for the false prophecies lasted 4 years instead of just less than a year as it did in Salem. And they lasted from about 1950 to about 1955 or 54. And in its original speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, shown on the upper left, Senator McCarthy was saying that he had many members of the American Defense Department who were secret communists. And he made many different accusations, accused many, many different people. Very few, if any of them, were actually tried and convicted. But many lives were ruined by by these accusations of Senator McCarthy. And he claimed to have secret government information because of his high classification level or whatever. And many, many lives were wrecked by his accusations. And actually, for a little bit of insight from motion pictures, there was a movie that sort of gave a fictional version of this, but with a lot more too, which we'll get to it. There was a senator, Senator Iceland, who made these same accusations of many people being communists, but never proving it or trying them. But Senator Iceland wasn't too bright, and he really didn't like the idea of varying all these numbers. Some of his Senate colleagues began to mock him for it, and he'd like it if he would just have one number, preferably an easy number to remember. Well, fortunately, the candidate's wife was much smarter than he is, and of course she was the evil genius that was behind all of this. And finally she gave in and said, okay, you want a single number? And he said, yes, and I'd like one that's easy to remember also. So she finally gave in, and as he's pouring ketchup on his meal, which you can see in the bottom right, she says, okay, the number will be 57. And I'm not sure whether Heinz Company still uses his 57 varieties, but it did for years. Okay, so let me have the next slide. Anyway, Senator McCarthy went a little further than he really could. He blamed the army of being infiltrated by some communists. And here's where the good witch turned up. The counsel for the army was an experienced lawyer named Joseph Welch. And the way he said it to McCarthy is, until this moment, Senator, I have never really gauged your cruelty or recklessness. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. And with this statement viewed by the entire country, Joseph Welch really ended the mass delusion. So, I would call Joseph Welch the Good Witch, and certainly another hero of mine in American history. And the next mass delusion was a really strange one. The false prophets this time were psychologists and social workers in the 80s and 90s. And here was a mass delusion that lasted nearly 20 years. And one thing you notice is that these mass delusions in this time of instant communication, they last longer and longer as you go from the modern times. Well, in the 80s and 90s, many preschool teachers were accused of sexual abuse of 3- and 4-year-olds by a new breed of false prophets. Psychologists and social workers, who I call the real 20th century witches, who over and over again interviewed kids, then 6 or 7, with their anatomically correct dolls, until they said what the false prophets wanted them to hear. To my mind, at least, the analogy with the Salem witchcraft trials is so close to be almost spooky. To my mind, the idea of these social workers aiming to get 6-year-olds to remember carefully what happened when they were 3, just as the 20th century version of spectral evidence. And yet, on the basis of this 20th century spectral evidence, no governor stood up to challenge the practice, as Governor Phipps did in the 1690s. In fact, I think the authorities in the 1690s acted more responsibly than those that did in the 1990s. Many people were in prison for long lengths of time until the people finally came to their senses. And let me just show 2 victims of this on the next slide. In the left is Gerald Amaral, the head of one of these preschools in Malden, Massachusetts, kissing his daughter Geraldine and his wife Patty after being wrongly imprisoned for 18 years and finally released. The guy served 18 years for these trials based on the 20th century spectral evidence. And finally, Dawn Wilson, a young pregnant single mother working in the kitchen. She wasn't even having that much to do with the children. She was offered a 10-year sentence and refused it because she knew she didn't do anything. And she was actually sentenced to life in prison in her trial. PBS series of Frontline, I think it was called, had the whole story of some of these people. And you see what happened to them. It just about brings tears to your eyes. Fortunately, she served 5 years before she was released. And she was released largely through the efforts of the Good Witch, who is on the next slide. The Good Witch here is Dorothy Rabinowitz, a Wall Street Journal reporter who saw this through this mass delusions and wrote a whole series of articles exposing the madness of it all. She won a Pulitzer Prize for it, and her description of meetings of the victims after they were released was really very moving. So we have another example of a good witch, as I described them, another one of my heroes, who ended this mass delusion after it persisted for 15 years or more. Okay, well, now I'll get to the real subject. Let me have the next view graph, Tom. The false prophets of climate change. Who are these people? Well, I don't want to use any names, but I'll say it's promoted by many false prophets. And to avoid personalities, let's just say that they're the participants in the yearly United Nations IPCC conference. The most recent one just ended in chaos in Belém, Brazil. I think that's the name of the city, where they had a fire, and the people weren't even allowed to throw toilet paper in the toilets because their plumbing was not really up to par. But these meetings are held in expensive, attractive cities. Well, maybe Belém was an exception. That doesn't sound very attractive to me. And they attacked many high government officials, captains of industries, celebrities, and various other grand poobahs, many flying in on their private jets, and needless to say, having a huge carbon footprint behind them in doing this. And let's just give one example of some of the problems of them. Let me have the next slide, Tom. Just to show how out of touch these people are, in the 2018 meeting, I don't recall what city it was in, they said that to avoid a climate catastrophe, the world would have to decrease its CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030, and then go to net zero by 2050. Well, we've already gone a good bit of this way. We're already almost finished with 2025, and the last time for which we have real statistics was 2024, which is halfway to 2020, which is halfway to 2030. Between 2018 and 2030, you're halfway there in 2024. And instead of decreasing input by, say, 25%, if you wanted to go to this 45% decrease by 2030, you'd want to decrease it by 20 or 25% by 2024. But instead, what did the world do? They increased it by about 10%. And yet we're certainly no closer to a climate catastrophe because of this. Let me have the next slide. So these false climate prophets failed both of the tests which we set out for prophets. Many others have investigated the science, technology, and economics and found it faulty. Certainly we in the CO2 coalition made many contributions to this. And finally, after 30 years of their telling us the sky is falling, the prophets of doom have just all proven to be false. So by both of the measurements that I set up to distinguish between true prophets and false prophets, these people fail both tests. Yet according to these false prophets of climate change, we're all guilty of original sin, which only they can discern. They see what we cannot, just like the psychologists and social workers in the preschool. And unless we drastically change our ways, these modern false climate prophets warn us of impending heat waves, floods, intense storms, throwing down fire from the heavens, rising sea levels. What could be more biblical? And they even remind you of another false prophet, which many of us have seen in a movie in the last 30 years ago. And this is Jules Winfield. Put him on. They sound like Jules Winfield, also known as Samuel L. Jackson from Pulp Fiction. And he was a hitman, but he was a religious hitman. And before he shot anybody, he would say, "And I will execute fierce vengeance upon them, and with furious rebuke, and they shall know that I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon them." This is what Jules said whenever he shot somebody, and from Ezekiel 25:17. So let me have the next one, Tom. Well, this is going to take a couple of minutes. Let's just see a tiny bit of the false information and harm that they've done. On the left-hand side is San Diego Harbor, a picture of it in 1966 and this year. And my gosh, it looks the same. Whatever happened to the rising sea level? After 60 years of extreme ocean rise due to climate change, it's not underwater now, or at least the water isn't a little bit higher. I mean, the water might have risen a few centimeters. Comparing these pictures, it certainly didn't rise anything like a meter. Another one of their false prophecies that doesn't come true. Well, you want windmills? Okay, take a look at Altamont Pass, California. You want windmills in your neighborhood? This is what some windmills providers, they'll be only too happy to set it up to look like this. And this certainly doesn't look like something which is going to save the environment. In fact, to me, it looks much more like an environmental disaster, which is a case I'll make. Another way it's an environmental disaster is here's a solar farm in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And the thing was just blown apart. And many of these solar panels were wrecked, and they contain complex water-soluble poisonous chemicals, and they can leach into the water supply if a thing is wrecked. That's certainly not something what you'd call something that improves the environment. Also, what happens when these windmills wear out? The windmill company is supposed to take them down, but that's 20 years later. Who knows if the company is still in business? And there are lots of examples on the internet you can find of abandoned wind terminals. Here are some in Harlingen, Texas. This was taken in 2017. And it certainly looks like these have been abandoned for a while. I don't know if they've been taken down or not. These windmills do have some salvage value, but one thing which has no salvage value is the base that's put in. Here it is in this picture, the middle picture on the bottom. The base is 500 tons of steel and concrete, and that's not going anywhere when you take the windmill down. And imagine what our 1,000 years, and these things last forever. Imagine what 1,000 years from now, what our descendants will think when they're walking around Altamont Pass, California. They just see these bases all over the place, and they're going to say, what the heck did our primitive ancestors, us, ruin this area by putting all of these monsters here, which don't do anything? There's another one, a picture of frozen solar panels in Germany in the harsh winter of 2021. And in the bottom right, there's electric buses on fire. These lithium-ion batteries, if they're not made exactly right, they can be a real severe fire danger. And here are a bunch of buses parked in a garage, and one of these batteries caught fire, and it just spread to all the other buses that were parked near them. Germany now forbids electric cars in underground garages for just this reason. And as all of us who've ever been on an airplane know, lithium-ion batteries are forbidden in aircraft luggage compartments, and for a very good reason. They used to be shipped, in freight carrying aircraft, and two of them carrying lithium-ion batteries exploded in the skies. One over Korea, one over, I think it was Abu Dhabi, obviously killing the crew, which is usually 3 or 4 people. And so, they knew that they couldn't ship lithium batteries on aircraft anymore, and couldn't even do it in the luggage compartment of passenger aircraft. So this is just a tiny pictorially of just a tiny bit of the harm and false information that we get from these false climate prophets. And on the next slide, I have just some headlines, which I'll get to. One thing is, and like I say, this is the little top of this isn't covered, but these are headlines and mostly in major media, and naturally, the major media blames everything but the windmills and solar panels and battery backups. Everything is at fault for all these problems except them. But how long can they keep doing this? Well, one headline is massive power outage in Spain and Portugal leave thousands of stranded and millions without light. And no person other than Chris Wright, our American Secretary of Energy, who knows a lot about energy and grids and all that, says it was because of the windmills and the solar panels. And these were let me just go. Oh yeah, the power went on very suddenly. You're riding in an elevator, all of a sudden the elevator stops. You're riding in an underground train, subway somewhere. All of a sudden it stops. The light goes out. Nothing happens for hours on end, and must have been scaring the hell out of these people. And frankly, I think that there were probably fatalities resulting from it, which weren't reported. I mean, it certainly isn't unreasonable to think that there might have been if you're just stuck in total darkness for hours with nothing, especially if you're in an elevator and it's just you. That must be scary as can be. And one point that Chris Wright made is that at the time of the blackout, Spain's power was powered 70% by windmills and solar panels. So, well, Mikey Sherrill, the successful Democratic governor of New Jersey, this is a headline, is right. New Jersey must declare an emergency on utility costs. And I'm a resident of New Jersey, and I certainly know how utility costs have been skyrocketing. Well, just my own comment on that, it's an emergency of their own making. All coal-fired power plants have been closed, as well as one of the 3 nuclear power stations, and several new gas lines have been rejected by Governor Murphy, and both Governor Murphy and Governor-elect Sherrill want more offshore wind power. So this is an emergency which they made. Just some other brief headlines. Raining in California's runaway electricity rates. It's way higher than most of the other countries, and they've made a big investment in wind and solar. Britain did the same thing. Why Britain's electricity rates are some of the highest in the country. Over 4 million people in Germany struggle to pay their gas and electric bills on time. California power grid faces potential reliability channels. And of course, according to the major media that made all these stories, everything was at fault except windmills and solar panels. Well, who do you believe? Your own lying eyes or what this media tells you? And here's one. It's not in the media. It's just in the media that just sort of happened to come across while we were in California from TripAdvisor, of all places. Hotel does not have generators. Review of the estate Yountsville, reviewed May 11th, 2025, very recently. This is a beautiful property, a charming hotel. Buyer beware if the power goes out. It is unacceptable for a hotel of this stature not to have generators. The power was turned off by PG&E for 4 hours during our stay. I was told that this happens frequently in California when it's windy. Guests pay for a luxury experience, and bottom line is no electricity is not acceptable. This is just from a random tourist who went to this hotel and the problems he had. So it's an example from both the pictures and the headline of really the harm that going through to windmills and solar panels with battery backups face us. Well, not only that, but there are strong, technically advanced countries which are hostile to the West that are not fooled by these false climate prophets. And here are the leaders of two of them. And I'm assuming everybody who's watching this knows who they are. They would love to see us go to net zero, ruin our economy and military so that they can move in and take over. Actually, I think the Chinese, I think I've said this once before, the Chinese are actually going a step further. They're actually manufacturing most of the solar panels, which they're selling to us, and the materials that you need for the windmills. And, they're putting up a few windmills, but basically they're going to coal. And my attitude is that they're getting rich selling us the rope that we have to hang ourselves. So, and it's not only hostile countries, but countries that are trying to develop and achieve more for themselves. And I have a few examples of that on the next slide. These are from countries that would probably be friendly with the Western countries. Here's Sultan Al-Jaber, the head of that big UN meeting in 2023. And his statement is, the fossil phase-out would not allow sustainable development unless we want to move back into caves. Indian President Modi, and he's the leader of a country of over 1 billion people in November of 2021, the colonial mindset hasn't gone. We are seeing the path that made developing nations developed is being closed to developing nations. Here's Nigerian President Bola Tinubu. He's in charge of a nation with a population of over 200 million people in 2023. Nigeria is an oil-producing nation and a developing economy that needs revenue from fossil fuels for growth, development, and to reduce poverty. Now, these countries are all going to attempt to develop as they see fit. There's just absolutely no stopping it. They want to have what we want to have, and who the heck are we to blame them for it? Anyway, earlier in this talk, I read a quote from Dick Lindsay, and I couldn't help plagiarizing it from a little. He was talking about the climate, and here I'm talking about windmills and solar panels. So here's my plagiarization of Lindsay's quote. What historians will definitely wonder about in future centuries is how false logic, obscured by shrewd and unrelenting propaganda from those who stand to profit, actually enabled a coalition of powerful special interests to convince the Western world that its power infrastructure, which basically works, must be replaced with another which will fail and along the way threaten Western civilization. It will be remembered not only as the greatest mass delusion, but also as the greatest con in the history of the world. That snake oil salesman at one time convinced the West to spend hundreds of trillions of dollars to throw out its working power system and replace it with a harebrained Rube Goldberg gadget. That's my variation on Dick Lindsay's rather well-known statement. So let me have this. Well, first, very briefly, does this mean that we have to use fossil fuel until the end of time, until the atmosphere is all carbon dioxide? And absolutely not. I won't go into it in detail, but in the paper I cited, I spoke to it a little bit more. There are nuclear options which will basically provide fuel for thousands and thousands of years if we tap both the fissile materials and the fertile materials. And they don't have any carbon dioxide emissions, but it'll take time to develop this. But there's at least a century of fossil fuel which the whole world can use, and we've got something like a century to develop these nuclear options. That they may be fusion, they may be fission, they may be a combination of both. There's just no need to panic. Let me have the next view graph, Tom. Well, I'll give two crazy digressions, and you'll see them here and probably nowhere else. And we'll see. I guess time will tell how crazy they are. First, is there anything like specular evidence in the false evidence that there is in the used to make the case of the onrushing climate crisis? And as you'll see, I think there is. Second, does brainwashing have anything to do with convincing the population of an oncoming crisis? And again, I think there might be. So let me first talk about the specular evidence today, Tom. Perhaps really using computer simulation and pretending it's real actual data. Stephen Kuhn, in his book, has long sections on numerical simulations of the climates and the many, many difficulties he sees with them as regarding to climate change. I've spent a good bit of my professional life on modeling complex physical problems with computer simulations, and there are many, many problems with applying computer simulations to the problem. And I actually wrote something about that and what's up with that website. And if you just put my name from April 27th, 2020. And what both Steve Koonin say and what I say, and what the people who do these climate simulations admit, is that there are many parameters that they set to what they call tune their codes, so that they can correct all sorts of things that they might think are errors, so that they can model in some way or other things that happen, which the code can't resolve because the grid cell is too big. When I was an undergraduate, we called them fudge factors. And I still kind of think of them as fudge factors. And there's a very interesting, I tried to look for some place that demonstrates this. And I think I found something which is interesting. It's a series of simulations by a French group. And the link to it is on the bottom. First, look at the upper left. Here's the temperature, world's temperature, as measured by 5, what I would think are surely reliable groups. There's NASA, there's NOAA, there's a British group. And so here is the temperature. Now, the French group has done a series of temperature simulations to try to match this to see what happens. And they tried to do it in two ways. One is they just used the simulation where they put in these they say with and without factors humains. That's the French. And let me translate that as fudge factors. So first, they just did the simulations as you would do it if you had the mathematical equations, and you tried to solve it. And that's the blue graph on the right. And if you can see the line, that's just the same line as the measured temperatures. So the blue graph is in a series of simulations they did to just with the physics as best they understand it. And the Navier-Stokes equations, the heating from the heatings from the coming, from the return of from the greenhouse effect, whatever, the clouds, whatever, they used the physics as best they understand it, and that's it. And they see that it diverges in a strange way. when you just do the physics as we understand it, you actually get a little bit of cooling. But actually, there was some heating. And there are a lot of experiments. John, the University of Alabama in Huntsville has done some. Typically they see they take some public figures of the simulations, which usually overestimate the heating, and the people who do these simulations say, look, we're in real trouble. But those simulations are all overestimating the heating. But this French group, when they do it without the fudge factors, it underestimates the heating. And of course, they put in the proper fudge factors, and this is the one in orange. And, they got a pretty good match. Who knows how well those particular fudge factors would work in the future. And let's go to someone and say, look, with just these parameters, I can do it. I must really be doing it right. Well, there's an interesting statement that John von Neumann made. He was one of the mathematical giants of the last 20th century. And someone tried to convince him that he had a typical theory, which he managed to get with only 4 parameters. And what John von Neumann said is, with 4 parameters, I can simulate an elephant. With 5, I can get him to wiggle his trunk. And years later, there are actually some people who tried to do this. And here's the elephant that they got on the lower right. Here's the reference to it. And with 4 parameters, just one of these would do it. But they put in the 5th parameter, and the elephant stays the same. But he's wiggling his trunk. So I got really a kick out of that. And my conclusion from this is that in a system as complex as the Earth climate, it takes just extraordinary hubris to tell policymakers to spend trillions because their numerical simulations give this or that result. Realistically, in my mind at least, it's not that different from the spectral evidence like used in Salem and in the preschools. The evidence will be whatever the computer programmer wants it to be, or maybe in some of these cases, whatever the computer program needs to continue his research grant. Well, let me go back to brainwashing. And in the Manchurian Candidate, the movie we saw with that senator, that not very bright senator and his Heinz ketchup, it also showed that an assassin could be completely controlled by extreme brainwashing. And in the Korean War, an American platoon was captured by the Chinese and sent to a lab in Manchuria, where they were subject to the brainwashing at the hands of the world's expert, a guy named Dr. Yen Lo, played by actor, I don't know how you pronounce this, I'll call him Kai D. And to demonstrate his power, he had this patrol sitting in front of a group of Russian and Chinese generals, and they looked just the way you'd expect Russian and Chinese generals to look by someone who wanted to sort of mock them. And to demonstrate his power in front of this group of generals, he actually had one soldier murder another in front of a room of these. So, you can get the guy to do that. They're really brainwashed. But because they were so brainwashed so thoroughly, they didn't even know they were in. The American platoon didn't even know they were in Manchuria. They thought they were in a ladies' garden club meeting in New Jersey. And Dr. Lowe, with humor, he always tries to bring his humor in, said he described their brains as not only being washed, but thoroughly dry cleaned. And I have a couple of images from this on the next slide. Okay, in the top image, in the center of it is Dr. Lowe, giving his talk in front of the Russian generals with the American platoon sitting there. And this isn't what the top thing isn't what the American platoon saw and heard. On the bottom, you have a way the American platoon saw and heard it. They're in a Gardens Club meeting in New Jersey. But one of the real purposes of the brainwashing was to get the platoon to love the member that it hated the most, Raymond Shaw, played by Lawrence Harvey. And whenever anyone asked him what they thought of this person that they all hated, the response in the movie was always, robotically, and let me have it on the next slide, Raymond Shaw is the kindest, bravest, warmest, most wonderful human being I have ever known. Well, let's take a look at some of the statements on climate change. Take The View's host Joyce Behar, and I have the references for all of these. The world is on a suicide mission. You know, with climate change, they have their heads in the sand. Or Greta Thunberg, our house is on fire. I am here to say our house is on fire. Chuck Todd, on a special issue of Meet the Press on December 30th, 2018, we're not going to debate climate change, the existence of it. The earth is getting hotter, period. And human activity is a major cause of it, period. We're not going to give time to the climate deniers. The science is settled, even if the political opinion is not. Well, Marsha McNutt, on taking over as the president of the National Academy of Sciences, of all things. God, she must be cringing whenever she thinks of this. The time for debate has ended. Action is urgently needed to reduce the per capita fossil fuel emission even further. Well, do these sound like the responses of the patrol when asked about Raymond Shaw? Were any of these brains thoroughly dry cleaned? I'll leave that to the listeners. Well, now let's talk about applicants for the Good Witch position. And I have 8 of them up here. First, there's Will Happer, who's probably the world's foremost authority on the radiation of, on the interaction of radiation of matter with complex molecules. Then there's Dick Lindzen, who has probably the world's foremost authority on geophysical fluid dynamics. Then there's Stephen Koonin, just a top-level scientist. He's been all over the place. He's been provost of universities, vice presidents of major industries, had high government positions which required Senate approval. Gus Burkout, who is sort of the European equivalent of Will Happer and actually started his own coalition called the Clintel Foundation, sort of like what Will Happer started with the CO2 Coalition. Bjorn Lomborg, who looks at the economics of what we want to do with climate change and, sees a problem which is maybe costing us $1 on the false profits of climate change, or saying that we've got to spend $1,000 to fix it. Judith Curry, who was a former department chairman at Georgia Tech of Earth Sciences, but she was so restricted in what she can say and what she couldn't say about it, I guess, to protect their research grants, that she ultimately resigned. She just couldn't stand it anymore. Greg Wrightstone, the current head of the CO2 Coalition, I guess my boss, if you want to call it something like that. Don't really see him that way, but he is the head of the coalition, and he's done many good things for it. I don't consider myself in the league of any of these people, but I decided to make it a group selfie. So there's me. And one thing about all of us is that we're all scholars. None of us really do things. We live in the world of ideas and maybe labs if we have it, but not things in the real world. And I like to think of us as, let's say, the tip of the spear in the movement to get this thing done. We've been bashing our heads against the wall, many of us for a decade, some of us for a lot more than a decade. Now we've scratched it. I mean, I say that we're the tip of the spear, and the tip of the spear can maybe scratch the wall a little, but it can't tear it down. But on the other hand, recently, it looks like we've had a spear attached to us as our actual tip. Now you can go to the next. Chris Wright, the new Secretary of Energy, has has put together a group of scientists who really know what they're doing. I'm pretty sure that Steve Koonin was one of them. And they said, this is really nonsense. We can't wreck our economy on this. And then Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA, has, changed a lot of the EPA rulings that you can't light a gas stove anymore without the government coming in and seeing it's okay. And he removed a lot of those rulings. And all this maybe have made room for the person that might be the good witch. Here's a picture of him. He's prevented a lot of subsidies for wind and solar. And perhaps he can huff and he can puff and he can blow down this gigantic house of cards. I don't know whether he can or not, but if he does, and if he can, he's certainly a contribution. He's certainly not exactly extremely popular, but if he does that, it'll be a real plus to his legacy. I think he can legitimately be called the good witch of the cold climate prophets.
Just for the audio only people, what you were talking about Donald Trump there.
Yeah, Chris Wright, Lee Zeldin, and a picture of Donald Trump, President Trump. And like I say, okay, so just my conclusions on all of this, going to net zero is no nirvana. Instead, it would provide unreliable power, as well as being a scientific, technical, public safety, economic, national security, and environmental disaster. Thank you, Tom. That's what I've got to say.
That was fantastic. I really enjoyed the stuff about the details about the Salem Witch Trials. I had not heard about that evidence in people's heads.
There's a book. My information came from a book called The Devil in Massachusetts. It was written by 1949 by Marion Starkey, I think was her name. And it goes into a lot of detail. And when they described the hysteria that the girls went on to, unfortunately, Marion Starkey preceded Elvis and the Beatles. If she had written the book after Elvis and the Beatles, I'm sure she would have just, pointed out that this is nothing unusual what these girls are capable of doing. So anyway, that's a terrific one. I don't know if it was written in 1949. I don't know if it's still available. The thing that really got me, the thing that just about brought tears to my eyes, were the cases in North Carolina, Massachusetts, and California for these preschool teachers. That poor girl, all she wanted to do was take her child. It ended a little happier for her. She was pregnant, and she finally married the father of her second child, and they moved to another place in North Carolina. And that gave me a really good feeling that she ended up on her feet. But Gerald Amaral was in jail for 18 years by that. It's unimaginable. For nothing. That's the one that, if any of them struck an emotion in me, that's the one that did.
It's just interesting to me you mentioned that, because there was another part of this crazy scandal now I'm in Minnesota, Jordan, Minnesota, and I'm going to be driving through there in like an hour or two. But I think it was the same thing where they got all these people accused of stuff based on this, based on no evidence that any of this happened. Yeah.
It's the 20th century specular evidence, which is the evidence of, and they said that these kids were brutalized. Well, they're right. They were brutalized, but they were brutalized by these psychologists and social workers, the real 20th century witches. I mean, these kids are now adults, and they know that their testimony sent people falsely to jail for decades, a decade and more. How do they live with themselves? That's what brutalized them.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I really enjoyed your whole presentation. Thank you for doing this. I think you made a great case that there's no evidence also in this crazy climate crisis thing. So just thank you for doing this. And I enjoy the fact that you're so humble about this, that you keep saying that you're no Will Happer, but none of us are Will Happer. But
Yeah, no,
of course,
that's well, Will Happer can do the same. He can say, well, I'm no Einstein or Isaac Newton, so we can all do it.
there we go. So any other points you want to make before we go ahead and finish this one up?
I can't really think of it. I think I made the case about as best as I could. And I sort of, I guess I'd say, with my, I was giving a talk about fusion in Rochester, and I kept saying, well, I don't want to be overly modest and I don't want to be overly immodest, but you want to do this and that and the other thing. And so I sort of felt that way doing this. Will Happer is certainly a guy that not many people are quite on his level. And I think Gus Burkhart's the same thing. Certainly, who was it? Bjorn Lomborg, Time magazine called him one of the 100 smartest people in the world. That's pretty good. But I think the thing that I think the contribution that I've made to this, if I've made any, a twofold. I mean, I won't say I contributed to the science. I wrote scientific papers on it. But I said, well, gosh, look, here's what they predict and here's what they see. And you don't have to be a brilliant scientist to do that. But I think I did, like I say, I don't want to be overly immodest. I think I did come on two separate things. One is the witches and the false prophets in the biblical and American history. And the other is the science societies. And this was an earlier podcast that and I tell Will Happer, I say, I want to expose these terrible things the science society is saying. And Will has sort of poo-pooed me. What do you want to do that? These people have been captured by it. There's nothing you can do about it. They're getting their money for it. And one of the few things that Will Happer and I sort of disagree on. I think these statements by the science societies are the foundation of the scientific justification of all of this. And if you tear down the foundation, you're ultimately going to tear down the superstructure. And those are the two contributions to this field that I'd say I'd made, the witches and the science societies. In fact, I was a lot of people have gone to the physical societies, including me, only to be ignored. But I sent a letter to the current head of the society, a guy named John Doyle. He actually got back to me, and we actually spoke for a few minutes. I was very impressed with him. I mean, I hope he does something. I mean, one of the points I made to him is that, who knows what Congress is going to do? They may call you guys in front of them and ask, give you the university president treatment. And if you listen to what I had to say, I have to say I was very impressed with him. And I really appreciated the time he spent with me. But, I mean, nobody did that for Steve Kuhn, but the other doing it for little tiny me.
So, yeah, that's really encouraging to me. And science is self-correcting eventually, right? They're not going to keep up these crazy statements 100 years from now. They got to correct it at some point. So maybe it'll happen.
Hopefully they're correcting it now, and hopefully I gave them a little push to do it, but time will tell.
And then, okay, I just wanted to mention that I will put a PDF copy of your slides up on my Substack, and people can access that from the show description. And then you also mentioned that maybe you'll have some shorter versions of some of your work on the CO2 Coalition on their podcast coming up.
I gave one already on the witches, and very soon I'm going to give one on the science societies.
Okay, so people can see those, I think, on the CO2 Coalition.
I think Angela Wheeler will distribute those. In fact, it's possible I'll even give it a day if I get back from my doctor's appointment in time. I'm going to call her, but I have her number in case I'm stuck in a traffic jam. So keep her waiting uselessly there.
All right.
In case the doctor says, "Oh no, you're not going anywhere. You're staying with me or doing this or that." The last time I went to him, he sent me to the hospital, and I was there for 3 days.
Not good. All right, I will let you go, but thanks a ton for what you're doing. I love your content, and thanks for all the work you're doing. Talk to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom.
Goodbye.
Take care.